Chloe.
The needle of the compass isn't pointing north. It's screaming, spinning in a frantic, blurred circle. Marcus, Chloe, and Gabe stand before a massive, gnarled oak tree, its trunk marked by a jagged, silver lightning scar. Marcus snatches a hunting knife and carves a deep, raw X into the bark. We run straight. No turning. No stopping, he commands. They bolt, their boots thudding against the forest floor for 10 straight minutes, eyes locked on the distant horizon. They burst into a clearing, gasping for air, and stop dead. There it is, the same oak tree. The X is still there, but it isn't fresh anymore. The wood around the carving is gray, weathered, and choked with ancient moss, as if a century has passed in 10 minutes. In this forest, geometry is broken. North, south, east, west, they all lead to the exact same coordinate. They've been walking for 6 hours, yet they haven't moved an inch. And as the sun begins to set for the third time in a single day, a cold realization hits. The forest isn't just looping, it's shrinking. How do you escape a prison with no walls? To find the exit, they have to stop moving. But in this place, stopping is the most dangerous thing they can do. The Emerald Knot wasn't supposed to be a death trap. It was supposed to be a weekend of high-res landscapes and off-the-grid, bragging rights. Marcus led the way, his chest puffed out with the confidence of a man who had survived 3 tours in the infantry. He viewed the wilderness as something to be conquered. Chloe followed, her eyes constantly darting to the rock formations. She was a geology student who understood the earth, or at least, she thought she did. Bringing up the rear was Gabe, a nervous photographer whose hands only stopped shaking when they were gripped around his Canon EOS. They had barely been in the woods for 4 hours when the forest started to tighten. "The trail is gone," Gabe whispered, looking at the overgrown path that seemed to have been swallowed by ferns in a matter of minutes. Marcus scoffed, pulling out his military-grade lens-static compass. "The trail doesn't matter. We head north. 3 miles, and we hit the main highway. Stick to the line." They walked. Marcus kept his eyes glued to the needle, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through dense thickets of pine. Exactly 30 minutes later, Gabe stopped. His boot had kicked something plastic. He reached down and picked up a crumpled blue water bottle. "Guys!" Gabe's voice was thin. "This is mine. I dropped this at the last rest stop." "Impossible!" Marcus snapped. "We've been walking a straight line for 2 miles. You must have a duplicate." But as he looked at the bottle, he saw the unique dent Gabe had made when he dropped it earlier. Marcus refused to believe his equipment was failing. He blamed the iron deposits in the soil for the compass glitch. "Fine, we use the sun. Old school. Sun is in the west, so we keep it to our left." They set off again, moving with a frantic pace. They covered 3 miles of grueling terrain. The trees began to look identical. Silver bark, weeping branches, and a strange, heavy silence that felt like pressure against their eardrums. Finally, they heard the sound of rushing water. "See!" Marcus grinned, pointing ahead. "The Blackwood River. We crossed this and we're out." They waded through the waist-deep, freezing water, fighting the current until they reached the muddy bank on the other side. They sat for a moment to catch their breath. But 5 minutes into their trek on the new side of the river, the sound of rushing water returned. They pushed through a final row of bushes and stopped. They were back at the river, but they weren't on the opposite side. They were standing on the exact same bank they had just left, looking at their own wet footprints in the mud across the water. They had crossed the river, walked straight, and somehow ended up back where they started without ever turning around. The forest was folding in on itself. Chloe felt a wave of nausea hit her. She looked down at her tactical watch to check the time. Her breath hitched. The second hand wasn't ticking forward. It was spinning backward in a frantic, blurred circle. "Marcus, look at the sky," she whispered, her voice trembling. The group looked up through the canopy. The laws of the universe had officially shattered. To the far east, a pale, morning sun was rising rapidly through the mist. But to the west, a blood-red sun was simultaneously sinking below the horizon. 2 suns, 2 different times of day, fighting for control over a sky that was turning a bruised, impossible shade of violet. The emerald knot hadn't just taken their direction. It had taken their reality. 24 hours had passed, but in the emerald knot, time was a rotting concept. Marcus, Chloe, and Gabe sat huddled in a clearing that felt smaller than it had an hour ago. "We need to eat," Chloe muttered, her voice sounding thin and metallic. She pulled a protein bar from her pack and took a bite. She immediately spat it out. It didn't taste like chocolate or oats. It tasted like cold, dry fireplace ash. Marcus tried his jerky, then his water. Everything was the same. The molecular structure of their supplies was being overwritten by the forest. The terror wasn't just in the food, it was in their own skin. They didn't feel the gnawing pangs of hunger or the parched throat of thirst. Instead, they watched in horror as their bodies began to waste away. Gabe's wedding ring slipped off his skeletal finger. Their muscles were atrophying in real time, as if the time loop was harvesting their physical energy to power the forest distortions. "The trees," Gabe whispered, pointing his flashlight into the thicket. "They're closer." The forest wasn't just a static loop. It was a giant biological Rubik's Cube. The trees weren't walking. They didn't have roots that moved. But every time a group blinked or turned their heads, the landscape shifted. A pine tree that was 20 feet away was suddenly 10. The horizon was being pulled inward, the forest floor folding like a piece of paper. Desperate for a sense of scale, Gabe looked at the lightning-scarred oak. "I'm going up," he said, his voice cracking. "I need to see where this ends." Gabe was a natural climber, but the higher he went, the more the air smelled of ozone and burnt plastic. He climbed 50 feet, 80, 100. Finally, he broke through the thickest part of the canopy. He looked down, seeing Marcus and Chloe as tiny dots on the forest floor, their flashlights looking like dying stars. But then, Gabe looked up. His heart nearly stopped. Above him, there wasn't sky. There was another canopy. And sitting on a forest floor directly above his head, looking down at him, were another Marcus and Chloe. He was trapped in a vertical sandwich of reality. He looked to his left, another forest. To his right, another forest. The emerald knot was in place. It was a self-contained cell, repeating infinitely in every direction, up, down, left, and right. "Marcus, Chloe," Gabe screamed, his voice echoing from above and below simultaneously. To prove he wasn't hallucinating, Gabe unstrapped his heavy DSLR camera. "Watch this," he yelled. He let go of the strap. The camera fell. It tumbled through the air for 3 seconds, but then it didn't hit the ground. 10 feet above Marcus's head, the camera hit an invisible seam in the air. There was a localized ripple, like a pebble hitting a pond, and the camera vanished in a static-filled glitch. A split second later, the camera reappeared, but it didn't fall from the sky. It materialized directly inside Marcus's open hand. Marcus stumbled back, his knees buckling under the weight. "Gabe, what did you do?" Marcus gasped. He held the camera up. It was no longer made of plastic, glass, and circuitry. The lens was a polished obsidian. The body was a single, seamless block of cold, gray granite. The glitch hadn't just moved the camera, it had transmuted it. Gabe looked at his own hands as he began to climb down. He noticed his fingernails weren't white anymore. They were turning a dull, stony gray. The forest was tired of looping them. It was starting to save them into the environment permanently. 48 hours. The clearing around the lightning-scarred oak had shrunk again. The wall of gray-skinned trees was now so close they could reach out and touch the shivering bark from where they sat. The emerald knot was no longer a forest. It was a tightening noose. The psychological toll was more devastating than the physical wasting. Marcus, the man of action, had become a man of rage. He paced a 5-foot radius of the clearing like a caged animal, his eyes darting to Gabe with simmering, irrational hatred. "It's you," Marcus hissed, his voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. "The forest is reacting to you. You and your damn cameras. You invited this." "Leave him alone, Marcus," Chloe shouted, though her voice lacked conviction. She was sitting in the dirt, frantically drawing geometric equations in the soil with a stick. She was trying to solve a non-euclidean trap with high school calculus. her mind refusing to accept that 1 + 1 no longer equaled 2. The space is folding. It's a Mobius strip made of wood and shadow. We just need to find the seam. While digging for a fresh patch of dirt, Chloe's stick hit something hard. She unearthed a tattered, moldy backpack buried just inches below the surface. With trembling hands, she pulled out a leather-bound journal. The air seemed to leave the clearing as she opened it. The handwriting was hers. Every loop of the L, every sharp cross of the T. It was an exact match, but the ink was faded, and the paper felt like it would crumble into ash. The date on the first page was January 17th, 1976. "This is a prank," Gabe whispered, his voice a ghost of his former self. "Chloe, tell me this is a prank." Chloe didn't answer. Her eyes moved down the final page, where the ink was still strangely dark. She began to read aloud, her voice flat and dead. It wasn't a diary of the past. It was a transcript of the now. It described their exact conversation from 10 minutes ago. Marcus's accusation, Gabe's fear, the smell of the ozone. The journal's final entry read, "We aren't hikers anymore. We are echoes. The forest is a record player and the needle is stuck. We are ghosts caught in a temporal trap, waiting to be pressed into a grain of the wood." A thick, oily black fog began to bleed from the trees, swallowing the clearing in seconds. It wasn't cold. It was heavy, smelling of old graves and wet wool. "Gabe? Marcus? I can't see you," Chloe screamed. From the heart of the black mist, a new sound emerged. "Gabe, honey? Is that you?" It was a woman's voice, soft, warm, and smelling of home. Gabe's mother. The mother who had been dead for 10 years. "Mom," Gabe called out, his eyes glazing over with sudden, hypnotic longing. "Gabe, no. Stay in the circle." Marcus yelled, lunging toward the sound of Gabe's footsteps. But Gabe was already gone. He stepped into a spatial fold, a ripple in the fog with a light bent at a 90-degree angle. He didn't fall. He simply vanished as if he'd been erased by a giant thumb. The fog cleared as quickly as it had arrived. The sun, all three of them now, blazed down on a clearing that was now only 3 feet wide. Gabe was gone. But as Marcus and Chloe turned toward the lightning-scarred oak, they saw something new. High up on the trunk, a fresh knot had formed in the wood. It wasn't a random growth. It was a perfect, hyper-realistic carving of Gabe's face, his mouth wide in a silent scream, his wooden eyes staring directly at them. The forest hadn't killed him. It had finally saved him. 60 hours. The emerald knot had stopped playing games. The clearing was no longer space. It was a coffin. The wall of gray, skin-like trees, was now only 18 inches from the lightning-scarred oak. Marcus and Chloe were forced to stand pressed against the rough bark of the anchor tree, their chests heaving in the thinning air. The forest was compressing, the very fabric of reality being crushed into a single, dense point. "It's not space, Marcus," Chloe gasped, her face inches from his. "We aren't traveling miles. We're traveling through layers of the same second. Every time we take a step, we're just flipping to a different page of the same moment. The oak tree, it's the anchor. It's the only thing that's truly now." Chloe looked at the Gabe knot on the trunk. It looked older now, the wood more polished, the scream more permanent. She realized the forest was a predator that hunted through observation. It mapped you, then it mimicked you, then it archived you. "The math is backwards," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a sudden, frantic realization. "Everything we've done has been based on looking forward, on finding an exit. But the forest only exists where we look. If we see it, it solidifies." She grabbed Marcus's hand. "We have to walk backward, and we have to do it with our eyes closed. If we don't observe the loop can't hold us." It was a suicidal plan. Walking backward in a shifting forest was like navigating a minefield in the dark. But they had no choice. The trees were no longer just standing. They were reaching. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot cracked through the clearing. A massive branch from a neighboring tree didn't just grow, it detonated. In a blur of motion, the wood surged forward at impossible speeds. Before Marcus could react, a jagged, thorn branch pierced through his thigh, pinning him directly to the trunk of the oak. Marcus screamed, a raw, guttural sound that was instantly echoed by the gabe knot above him. Marcus! Chloe lunged for him, but the forest was accelerating. New branches were weaving together like a basket, a cage of silver was knitting itself shut around the clearing. Within seconds, Marcus's leg wasn't just pinned. The bark was already beginning to fuse with his skin, his blood being sucked into the thirsty grain of the wood. Go! Marcus wheezed, his face turning the same dull gray as the camera Gabe had dropped. He could feel his nervous system being rewritten, his nerves becoming fibers, his bones turning to heartwood. I'm not leaving you. You have to. Marcus grabbed her collar, pulling her close. His eyes were already starting to glaze over, turning into the hard, polished obsidian of the forest's observers. Listen to me, he whispered, his voice vibrating with a wooden resonance. The tree isn't the exit, Chloe. It's not the door. The tree is the observer. It's the eye of the forest. You can't outrun it. You have to blind it. He shoved her away with the last of his human strength. As the silver branches closed over his head, weaving a tomb of living wood, the last thing Chloe saw was Marcus's hand reaching out, his fingers lengthening and hardening into twigs. Chloe stood alone in the dark, the cage almost complete. She took a deep breath, reached for her bandana, and tied it tightly over her eyes. She turned her back to the oak and took her first, trembling step into the unknown. Chloe stood at the base of the lightning-scarred oak, the cage of branches now so dense she could barely move her arms. The air was a thick soup of ozone and the scent of ancient wood. She knew the truth now. The emerald knot wasn't a place of broken physics. It was a sentient entity that fed on visual recognition. If you looked at it, it looked back. And once that connection was made, the forest rendered your reality, locking you into a permanent, shrinking loop. The tree is the eye, she whispered, her hand shaking as she pulled her thick scarf from her neck. She didn't just close her eyes. She tied the scarf so tightly it pressed against her eyelids. She needed to become invisible to the forest by making the forest invisible to her. She turned her back to the oak. 1 step, 2 steps. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. Chloe, don't leave me. It was Marcus's voice, but it wasn't the gravelly wheeze of a dying man. It was loud, clear, and filled with agony. I'm free. I found a way. Just look at me, Chloe. Look back. Her heart screamed at her to turn around. Every instinct she possessed told her that leaving her friend was a sin. Chloe, look at the shot I got. Now it was Gabe. His voice was energetic, exactly as it had been on the first day. The light is perfect. Just 1 second, Chloe. Just peek. The sound became a physical assault. She felt cold, twig-like fingers clawing at her shoulders, trying to spin her around. The branches of the cage hissed against her ears like snakes. The forest was desperate. It was audio mining her deepest attachments, throwing every voice she loved into a chaotic, screaming symphony to force her to open her eyes. If you look, you stay, she told herself, her teeth gritted so hard they felt like they would shatter. She started to run. She ran blindly, her boots tripping over roots that felt like they were trying to grab her ankles. She crashed through thickets of thorns that sliced her arms. She ignored the voices. She ignored the feeling of Marcus's hand on her arm. She focused only on the darkness behind the scarf. Then, the temperature dropped. The heavy, metallic smell of the knot vanished. It was replaced by the crisp, sharp scent of pine needles and exhaust fumes. Chloe tripped over something hard and flat. Not a root, but an asphalt curb. She tumbled forward, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. She didn't move. She waited for the voices. She waited for the gabe knot to speak. Silence. Only the distant, beautiful sound of a car engine. She ripped the scarf off. She was lying on the shoulder of Highway 12. A black SUV slammed on its brakes, the driver jumping out with a look of pure shock. "Oh my God! Are you okay?" the driver yelled, running toward her. "You just stumbled out of trees like a ghost." "My friends." Chloe gasped, her voice a dry rasp. "We were in there for 3 days. You have to call the Rangers. Marcus and Gabe, they're still at the tree. The driver slowed down, looking at her with a mix of pity and confusion. 3 days? Miss, the news report just went out. Your car was found at the trailhead. You've only been missing for 72 minutes. Chloe froze. To the world. She had barely been gone for an hour, but as she looked at her reflection in the SUV's tinted window, she saw the price of the filter. Her hair, once dark and vibrant, was now a shocking, brittle white. She reached into her pocket, feeling a sharp edge. She pulled out a small, flat piece of bark that had been forced into her pocket during her escape. It wasn't just wood. On the inner side of the bark, there was an image, a high-definition recording etched into the fibers. It was a photo of her, Marcus, and Gabe standing in front of the oak. They were smiling, but they weren't wearing their modern hiking gear. They were dressed in heavy wool suits and flapper dresses from the 1920s. The forest hadn't just taken their space. It had swapped their era. Chloe had escaped the loop, but she had left her future and her identity in the grain of the wood.